Get out, Bradley. You're redundant, and your legacy code is trash. Those words echoed through the marble lobby of Vance Logistics as Travis Vance, the newly appointed CEO, waved two burly security guards over. He smirked, adjusting his designer tie, while he handed me a cardboard box containing my coffee mug, a mechanical keyboard, and a family photo. I did not yell. I did not threaten him. I just stared at his smug, 34-year-old face, nodded slowly, and walked out into the cold October rain. Travis thought he had just streamlined the company and saved a clean $150,000 in annual salary. He had no idea that he had just pulled the pin on a financial grenade, and the timer was already ticking. Before that humiliating exit, my workspace was the windowless basement office of Vance Logistics in Indianapolis, Indiana. For 18 years, that room was my sanctuary. I sat amidst the low, comforting hum of server racks, dual monitors casting a blue glow over my desk. I was the chief systems architect, a fancy title for a guy who spent nearly 2 decades keeping a $48 million logistics empire from collapsing into absolute chaos. Back in 2008, Vance Logistics was a struggling local trucking outfit with only 20 regional trucks. The founder, Gerald Vance, was a hard-working man who knew everything about diesel engines but nothing about software. He hired me when I was 30 years old, desperate for someone to build a proprietary dispatch and routing system. I spent 9 months writing what would become VanceRoute. It was a custom application built on a PostgreSQL database, wrapped in optimized C++ routines and Perl scripts designed to calculate the most efficient routes, track driver hours, and manage cargo dispatch in real time. In those early days, the company could not afford to pay my market rate. So, Gerald and I struck a deal. We signed a contract in November 2008. I agreed to accept a lower starting salary in exchange for retaining the intellectual property rights to the core VanceRoute engine. I granted Vance Logistics an exclusive, month-to-month license to run the software for a symbolic fee of $1. Under Clause 14(c) of that original agreement, the license was automatically revocable if the company ever defaulted on payments to me or failed to pay any contractually owed compensation within 15 days of its due date. Gerald did not care about the fine print back then. He just wanted a system that worked. Over the next 18 years, Vance Logistics grew exponentially. That small 20-truck operation expanded into a massive network of 1,200 trucks operating across 6 Midwestern states. As the company grew, VanceRoute grew with it. I patched it, updated it, and kept it running through every holiday rush, every blizzard, and every server migration. It was a classic legacy system. To an outside observer or a fresh-faced MBA graduate, the code looked messy. It was filled with custom routing exceptions, manual database triggers, and decades of tech debt. But it worked. It was highly optimized for our specific regional routes, bypassing toll roads, predicting traffic bottlenecks, and scheduling maintenance stops with 99% accuracy. Because I was the only one who understood the inner workings of VanceRoute, I was the only line of defense. I worked 60-hour weeks, took my laptop to family dinners, and answered support calls at 3 in the morning. My compensation was a base salary of $150,000, which was well below the market average for a senior systems architect with my level of responsibility. However, my contract also included an uptime incentive. If the system maintained a 99.99% uptime over a 5-year block, I was entitled to an accrued performance bonus of $159,000. By October 2026, I had hit that target. The 5-year block was complete, and VanceRoute had not suffered a single unscheduled outage. That $159,000 was officially due on my next paycheck. I planned to use that money to pay off the remaining mortgage on my house and start a college fund for my nephew. But things changed when Gerald Vance retired. He handed the keys of the company to his nephew, Travis Vance. Travis was a 34-year-old business school graduate who believed that experience was an unnecessary expense. He arrived at the office with a team of consultants, talking about digital transformation, cloud migration, and cutting operational fat. To Travis, I was not the architect who built the foundation of the company. I was a 50-year-old relic sitting on an overpriced salary, guarding a pile of obsolete legacy code, What Travis did not realize was the security architecture I had built into VanceRoute. The software was not hosted on the company's local servers. The database itself lived on their hardware, but the core routing engine and the license validation server were hosted on a private server cluster that I owned and operated from my home basement. Every 10 seconds, the local client application at the Vance Logistics headquarters sent an encrypted ping to my private server. My server validated the license, decrypted the routing data using a unique private PGP key that only I possessed, and sent the decrypted coordinates back to the dispatch terminals. If that validation loop ever broke, the client application would immediately lock up, encrypting the local cache databases to prevent data corruption. I kept this setup not out of malice, but out of necessity. Gerald had known about it and preferred it that way, as it saved him the cost of hosting the licensing servers himself. But Travis never bothered to read the technical documentation. He never read the original 2008 contract, and he certainly did not understand how a PGP encryption loop worked. He only saw a line item on the budget sheet. He saw a senior developer making a six-figure salary, an upcoming $159,000 bonus payout, and a legacy software system that he believed could be easily replaced by a cheap offshore development team. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson in technical debt. The conflict began on a rainy Tuesday morning in mid-October. I was in the middle of analyzing a database deadlock issue that was slowing down the automated dispatch queue for our Chicago terminal. My phone rang. It was Travis Vance's executive assistant, telling me the CEO wanted to see me in the top-floor boardroom immediately. I saved my query, locked my workstation, and took the elevator up, feeling a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. When I entered the boardroom, Travis was not alone. Sitting next to him was a younger man named Kevin, whom Travis had recently hired as the director of digital strategy. On the table between them was a thick, glossy binder titled Project Phoenix, Vance Logistics Cloud Migration. Travis did not offer me a seat. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. He told me that my services as a systems architect were no longer required. He explained that Kevin's team had spent the last 3 months working with an offshore development firm based in Bangalore. They had created a new cloud-based wrapper that would theoretically replace VanceRoute by the end of the month. According to Travis, this migration would save the company over $200,000 a year in server maintenance and personnel costs. I looked at Travis, then at Kevin. I asked them if they had run any stress tests on the database integrations or if they had mapped out the regional routing exceptions. Kevin smiled dismissively, waving his hand, and said that their offshore partners were experts in API integrations. He claimed that the modern SaaS wrapper could handle everything our old legacy system did, but with a sleek web interface. I knew immediately that they had no idea what they were doing. They had built a beautiful front-end paint job on top of a crumbling database engine, without understanding how the engine actually processed data. I did not argue. Instead, I brought up the elephant in the room. I pointed out that my 5-year uptime cycle had ended on October 1st and that my contractually agreed performance bonus of $159,000 was due. I asked when I could expect the payout. Travis laughed. It was a cold, arrogant sound. He leaned forward and told me that the company would not be paying a single dollar of that bonus. He argued that since VanceRoute was being retired, the uptime metrics were irrelevant. He claimed that the bonus clause was a relic of his uncle's outdated management style, and that the board would never approve such a large payout for a system they were about to shut down anyway. He then accused me of trying to hold the company hostage with obsolete code. Before I could reply, Travis slid a document across the table. It was a severance agreement. He offered me 2 weeks of base salary, which amounted to just under $6,000, on the condition that I sign the waiver immediately. The waiver was a legal trap. It required me to release Vance Logistics from all financial liabilities, including my accrued $159,000 bonus. More importantly, Section 4 of the document stated that I would permanently transfer all copyright, patents, and intellectual property rights related to VanceRoute and its underlying code to Vance Logistics. I read the document slowly, page by page, while Travis tapped his gold watch impatiently. I reached the end, put the pen down on the table, and looked Travis dead in the eye. I told him that I would not sign the agreement. I explained that the severance offer did not cover my earned bonus, and that the intellectual property of VanceRoute was not mine to sign away under these terms. Travis's face turned red. He stood up, slamming his hand on the mahogany table. He screamed that I was nothing but a glorified maintenance dinosaur who was standing in the way of progress. He shouted that my legacy code was worthless trash and that they did not need me or my permission to run their operations. He told me I was fired on the spot for insubordination and breach of company policy. He then called security to have me escorted out of the building. I remained completely calm. I did not raise my voice or react to his outburst. I simply stood up, walked back down to the basement, and packed my personal items into a single cardboard box. The two security guards stood at the entrance of my office, watching me like I was a criminal. I unplugged my mechanical keyboard, placed my family photo inside the box, and walked out of the building without looking back. As I drove home through the Indianapolis traffic, my mind was racing, but not with panic. I felt a strange sense of clarity. Travis believed he had won a corporate chess match. He thought he had saved his company a massive bonus payout and a six-figure salary. He did not know that by firing me and refusing to pay my bonus, he had triggered a countdown clock. According to Clause 14S of my 2008 contract, Vance Logistics had a 15-day grace period from the due date of any outstanding payment before the software license was officially breached. Because they had failed to pay my salary for the final pay period and refused to pay the $159,000 bonus, the countdown had begun. I decided that I would not call Travis. I would not send angry emails. I would not warn Kevin. I would simply go home, sit in my basement, and wait out the 15 days in absolute silence. I knew what would happen next. They would try to run their new system using the legacy database. They would try to bypass my server, and within 2 weeks, the system would request its bi-weekly license validation handshake. When my private server did not receive the payment confirmation, the handshake would fail. I parked my car in my driveway, walked down to my home office, and looked at the glowing green lights of my private server rack. The trap was set, and Travis Vance had walked right into it. During the 15-day grace period, I did not waste a single moment. I hired a sharp corporate contract attorney named Sarah Jenkins, who was 45 years old and specialized in intellectual property and software licensing. Sarah reviewed my original November 2008 contract, Gerald's signature, and the payment logs. She confirmed that Travis's refusal to pay my final salary and my accrued $159,000 bonus put Vance Logistics in clear, indefensible breach of Clause 14C. Sarah drafted a formal notice of license termination and sent it via registered mail to the Vance Logistics legal department. The notice was clear. If the outstanding debt was not settled by October 29th, the license to use the core database engine of VanceRoute would be permanently revoked, and any continued use of the software would constitute copyright infringement. Predictably, Travis ignored the letter. According to a former colleague who texted me from the office, Travis had laughed when the legal department brought him the notice. He told them that I was bluffing, and that his offshore team had already successfully integrated their new SaaS wrapper with the VanceRoute database. He believed they were completely independent of my basement servers. He did not understand that the wrapper was only a pretty dashboard. It still relied on the legacy core to decrypt the routing tables and run the scheduling algorithms. On the night of October 29th, I sat in my home office with a cup of black coffee. It was 11:55 p.m. On my monitor, I had a terminal window open, displaying the live log files of my private validation server cluster. At midnight, the bi-weekly automated handshake would initiate. The mechanism was simple but absolute. Every 2 weeks, the Vance Logistic Database server at headquarters was programmed to query my validation server. My server would check a secure banking API to verify that my salary and bonus payments had been deposited. If the payment validation was successful, my server would sign the transaction using my private PGP key, allowing the local database to remain decrypted and operational for the next 14 days. If the payment verification failed, the validation server would refuse to sign, and the local database would automatically enter a secure lockdown state. At 12 midnight, the log screen flashed. A connection request came in from the Vance Logistics server IP address. My script initiated the verification API. It searched the transaction history for my bank account, looking for the $159,000 bonus and my final payroll deposit. The search returned 0 results. The system paused for a 3-second timeout, and then the console text turned red. Payment verification failed. Signature request denied. Instantly, my server terminated the handshake. In my terminal, I executed a pre-written shell script that officially revoked the PGP decryption key. Without my server's active signature, the database client at the Vance Logistics headquarters triggered its self-protection routine. It was a security measure I had built years ago to prevent unauthorized database copying. The system immediately locked down all active database tables, encrypting the core routing data using a secondary 256-bit AES key. It then terminated all incoming and outgoing connections, effectively freezing the database. I watched the console scroll by as the database shut down terminal by terminal. Within 90 seconds, the entire Vance route system was dark. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. I knew exactly what was happening at that very moment in the regional warehouses. Across 6 states, at 12 different distribution terminals, the dispatch monitors would have suddenly frozen. The proprietary scheduling software would be displaying a critical database connection error. At the Indianapolis hub, 45 regional freight trucks were scheduled to depart between midnight and 2 a.m. to deliver shipments to retail warehouses across Ohio and Illinois. None of those trucks could move. The warehouse management system could not generate the digital manifests, calculate the weight distributions, or assign the specific regional routes. The automated warehouse gates would not open because the gate control system was directly integrated with the Vance Route database to verify truck licenses. Kevin's new Project Phoenix SaaS wrapper, which was supposed to go live the following week, instantly crashed. Because it was built as a thin layer on top of my API, the loss of the core database connection meant the wrapper had nothing to read or write to. It became a useless, empty web page. By 12:15 a.m., my personal cell phone began to vibrate on my desk. The caller ID showed the number for the Vance Logistics Network Operations Center. I did not answer. 10 minutes later, a text message arrived from my former colleague in the IT department. The database is down. Everything is locked. Kevin and Travis are on their way to the office. What did you do? I did not reply. I turned off my phone, closed my laptop, and went to bed. For 18 years, I had been the one panic answering their calls in the middle of the night, sacrificing my sleep to keep their trucks moving. That night, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I slept like a baby. I knew that every hour the system remained offline, Vance Logistics was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in late delivery penalties and idle driver wages. The clock was now ticking on Travis's terms, and his arrogance was about to cost him a fortune. By Friday morning, the chaos at Vance Logistics was absolute. When I turned my phone back on at 8 a.m., I had 37 missed calls and dozens of urgent emails. The regional news was already reporting massive traffic backups near our major distribution centers in Indianapolis and Chicago. Because the automated routing and manifest systems were completely offline, trucks were backed up for miles on the interstate, unable to enter or exit the warehouse yards. 1,200 shipping runs had been canceled or delayed. Vance Logistics was the primary regional carrier for major retail giants, including Walmart and Amazon. These companies operated on a strict just-in-time delivery model. Under our service level agreements, every hour a delivery was late resulted in an automatic $10,000 penalty. By 9 a.m., the company was already facing over $500,000 in immediate contract penalties, and the numbers were climbing every minute. At the headquarters, Travis Vance was in a state of complete panic. According to my former IT colleague, Travis had spent the night screaming at the offshore development team in India over a Zoom call. He had demanded that they bypass my validation server and force decrypt the PostgreSQL database. But the offshore developers had to explain the harsh reality of modern cryptography to the young CEO. The database was locked with a 256-bit AES encryption key. Bypassing it was mathematically impossible without the private PGP key stored on my home server cluster. Even with the fastest supercomputers in the world, brute forcing the encryption would take millions of years. The offshore team's lead developer finally admitted that their SAS wrapper was completely useless without the decrypted core database. They had no way to restore the system. At 10 a.m., Travis tried to call me again. When I did not answer, he sent a long, frantic email filled with caps lock and exclamation points. He accused me of sabotage, claiming that I was intentionally destroying the company's computer systems. He threatened to call the FBI and file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for damages, claiming I was in violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I did not reply to his email. Instead, I forwarded it to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was prepared. She immediately drafted a formal response and sent it to Travis, carbon copying the company's general counsel and the board of directors. Her email was cold, professional, and legally airtight. She pointed out that there was absolutely no sabotage. I had not hacked their systems, nor had I installed any malware. The software had simply behaved exactly as programmed under the terms of the signed November 2008 contract. Sarah wrote that Vance Logistics had failed to pay my contractually owed salary and my accrued $159,000 performance bonus. Because the 15-day grace period had expired, the software license had automatically terminated. As the sole owner of the intellectual property of the core Vance Root engine, I was under no legal obligation to provide decryption keys or validation signatures for a product that the company no longer had a license to use. Furthermore, she warned that any further attempts by their offshore team to copy, bypass, or decrypt the database would be treated as willful copyright infringement under Title 17 of the United States Code, which carried statutory damages of up to $150,000 per violation. She then laid out my terms for resolving the crisis. First, the company had to pay my accrued $159,000 performance bonus in full. Second, they had to pay my unpaid final payroll salary of $6,000. Third, they had to pay all legal fees I had incurred, which amounted to $35,000. Fourth, if they wanted to permanently own and control the Vance Root software and its underlying source code so they could manage their own migrations in the future, they would have to buy out the intellectual property rights from me for a flat fee of $1,600,000. Finally, the board of directors had to sign a mutual release agreement, permanently waiving any future legal claims against me. The total financial demand was $1,800,000. When Travis read the email, he reportedly threw his coffee mug against the boardroom wall, screaming that he would rather let the company burn to the ground than pay a single dime to a dinosaur who was holding him hostage. He called the corporate lawyers, demanding they file an emergency injunction to force me to turn over the keys. But the general counsel had to break the bad news to him. The 2008 contract was valid, the intellectual property clause was clear, and the company was in obvious breach of contract for non-payment. Any attempt to seek an injunction would take weeks to crawl through the federal courts, and during that time, the company would be losing $600,000 a day. Vance Logistics would be bankrupt long before they could get a judge to look at the case. By noon, the company's board of directors, led by the major institutional shareholders who owned 60% of the company's stock, stepped in. They had discovered the reason behind the system blackout. They realized that Travis's attempt to save $150,000 in salary and dodge a $159,000 bonus had paralyzed a $48 million corporation, destroyed customer relations with Walmart and Amazon, and cost the company over $1 million in a single morning. An emergency board meeting was called for 2 p.m., and Travis Vance was about to face the consequences of his arrogance. The emergency board meeting did not last long. The major shareholders, furious at the sudden collapse of operations and the threat of losing their largest retail contracts, took control of the situation. At 3 p.m., my attorney Sarah Jenkins received a phone call from Vance Logistics general counsel. Travis Vance had been officially suspended from his duties as CEO. The board had brought back Gerald Vance, the 65-year-old retired founder, to act as interim CEO and resolve the crisis. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. This time I answered. It was Gerald. His voice sounded tired, and he sighed deeply before speaking. He apologized to me. He said that Travis was young, arrogant, and did not understand the value of the people who built the company's foundation. He admitted that firing me and refusing to pay my bonus was the stupidest decision the company had ever made. He asked me what it would take to get Vance Route back online immediately. I told Gerald that I respected him, but my terms were non-negotiable. I wanted the full settlement as outlined by my attorney. I needed the $159,000 performance bonus, my final salary, my legal fees covered, and the full buyout of the Vance Route intellectual property for $1,600,000. Gerald did not argue. He knew that every hour the database remained encrypted, the company was bleeding money. He agreed to all terms. He told me that the board had already authorized the wire transfer and that their legal team was preparing the final IP transfer agreement and mutual liability release. Within 90 minutes, Sarah confirmed that the legal documents had been signed by the board and sent to us. I checked my bank account online. The wire transfer of $1,800,000 was pending, and by 4:30 p.m., the funds were officially cleared. I signed the contract, transferring the copyright and ownership of the Vance Route source code to Vance Logistics. I then sat down at my workstation and loaded my private server console. I executed the final script, transmitting the active PGP signature key to the database server at headquarters. The remote database received the validation, decrypted the AES routing tables, and reopened the connection ports. Across the Midwest, the dispatch screens flashed back to life. The automated warehouse gates opened, and the backlog of trucks began to move. The Network Operations Center reported that the system was fully functional, with zero data loss. The crisis was over. I did not return to the windowless basement office. My career at Vance Logistics was finished, but I left on my own terms. At 48 years old, I was financially independent. The $1.8 million buyout, combined with my savings, allowed me to retire comfortably. I bought a small lake house in northern Indiana, built a state-of-the-art home laboratory, and finally had the time to teach my nephew how to build his own computers. Over the next 2 years, I kept in touch with a few friends from the IT department. They told me that Vance Logistics had struggled constantly after my departure. Travis Vance was permanently fired by the board 3 months after the incident. The new management team spent over $3 million trying to migrate from Vance Route to a modern commercial SaaS platform. They hired 3 different consulting firms and went through 2 offshore development teams, but they could never replicate the efficiency and reliability of my legacy database. The custom routing algorithms I had written in 2008, which Travis had called obsolete tech debt, turned out to be a highly engineered masterpiece that kept their entire business profitable. Without it, their operational costs increased by 12%. Sometimes, I look back at my 18 years in that basement office. I think about the long nights, the endless lines of code, and the stress of keeping the system alive. But most of all, I think about the satisfaction of standing my ground. Arrogant managers like Travis Vance believe that programmers are replaceable parts in a machine, and that legacy code is just a hurdle to be cleared. They do not realize that the systems they rely on are built on the sweat and intelligence of the people they look down upon. They forget that when you treat the people who build your foundation like dirt, they can easily walk away, taking the foundation with them.